We had this basketball player who was kind of bad news. He ends up giving his life to the Lord and walking out of the room and running into a man in a wheelchair with some tumors that you could see around his face. And this basketball player he tells his story. He's like, I grabbed my girlfriend and I had seen it happening, and now I was a believer, so I can pray for him. And he prayed for this guy, and this guy was healed. And
like visibly, his face is different.
Visibly, tumors disappear. He's out of his wheelchair. And this is a basketball player who had known Jesus for 30 minutes. That guy did not know better.
What's it like to be inside the Asbury Outpouring of 2023? Well, I take you inside exactly what happened with the guy who preached the sermon that kicked it all off. He said it was a stinker, but it sparked revival, a global phenomena that saw over 100,000 leaders travel from around the world to be in on what God is doing. Kind of sparked the Gen Z revival we're seeing. Hey, welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. So glad you joined us today. This kicks off part 1 of our 5-part revival series. There is something in the air right now, something God is doing that is really noteworthy. We see trends changing in real time, and they're hopeful. Gen Z is more open than ever. A lot of young Gen Z men are coming to faith. It's happening across America. It's happening in the UK. It's happening around the world. What is going on? That's the purpose of this 5-part series. So if you're new to my YouTube channel, hit the subscribe button because you're not going to want to miss. We got John Tyson, Nikki Gumbel, Al Gordon, Luke Lefevre, Stephen Foster. We've got to Andy Wood, lead pastor of Saddleback, and JP Pokluda, all in on this series. And they're going to talk about what they're seeing about the revival, what you can learn as a church leader, in what God might want to do in your community or in your church. So I'm really excited for this series. We're so glad you joined us. So like, subscribe, leave a comment to join the conversation. Also, we have a real dialogue happening in the Art of Leadership Academy. That's my free program for church leaders. We got over 8,000 leaders in there right now. Pastors just like you, troll-free environment, and the quality of the conversation is amazing. So click the link in the description or go to careynieuwhof.com/show notes to get in on that. Would love to have you join. Now, before we get into my interview with Zach, a word from today's partners, and then we'll dive into the conversation. Today's episode is brought to you by my Art of Leadership Academy. So in this episode, Zach shares the insight that humility is giving both successes and failures of every sermon back to God. But here's the tension. Just because God brings the power doesn't mean we can skip the prep, right? You still have to study. You still got to pray. And God is as present in the preparation as he is in anything else. So you got to show up ready to give your absolute best because ultimately God is choosing to work through you. Well, inside the Art of Leadership Academy, there are a lot of resources to help you prepare and preach better sermons, articles, videos, my preaching cheat sheet, and my course with Mark Clark on preaching, the art of preaching, which over 3,500 preachers have used to hone their gifts as a preacher. We teach you things like how to speak to unchurched people, how to do the sermon prep process, how to deliver a talk without using notes, how to create a clear and compelling bottom line. Now, I know it's more mysterious than that, but hey, when you improve your skill set, everything gets better. Plus, we also break down episodes like this in the community conversation, one every week with real-time insights, discussions, and encouragement from other preachers walking the same road. It's a troll-free environment. I think you're really going to love it. You can join today by clicking the link in the description of this episode, or you can go to the artofleadershipacademy.com. I'd love to connect with you inside. Today's episode is brought to you by Parkhill. You know, church design is changing, and Parkhill is leading that change. Today's forward-thinking ministries are moving from pews to circles, from crowds to true community, and from auditorium seating to vibrant multi-purpose campuses. Parkhill doesn't just understand this shift, they're actually shaping it. Coast to coast, they're having real conversations with dynamic, growing churches about how to build spaces that reflect mission, foster connection, and honor stewardship. Their approach is responsive, sustainable, and grounded in partnership. And most importantly, guess what they do? They work with your budget, not theirs, to make your vision a reality. So with a scalable process designed to protect kingdom resources, Parkhill empowers churches to join the 20% who see their plans built and their purposes fulfilled. Your vision deserves more than plans. Discover how to be the 20 at parkhill.com/faith. That's parkhill.com/faith. Well, Zach, Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, honored to be here, brother.
Yeah. So we're focusing on revival over these next few episodes, and you are near the center of what became a global spiritual phenomena, the Asbury Outpouring, back in February of 2023. I got a lot of time. Tell us the story. I mean, I think most of us have little pieces of it or clips of it, but if you're going to narrate, like maybe even go back to the day before, week before, whatever, take us through the story and how you experienced it and what happened.
Yeah, so Asbury University, I think it is a unique place because it's been host of multiple unique encounters with the Lord. All the way back to one of their first stories is when E. Stanley Jones, like a heroic missionary in the Christian faith, was a student and encountered the Spirit in like 1905 in a unique outpouring of the Spirit in Hughes Auditorium. And then you zip to 1970s, like right before the Jesus movement, there was an outpouring of God's Spirit. And even some of the people connected to the Jesus movement testified to being impacted by students that had been sent from this university in Kentucky called Asbury. And what was interesting was I've been a college pastor in the area, not at Asbury, but in the area, and have caught the scene revival as like this idol at Asbury. Like we're always looking back at like, it's like a guy who's like won state in high school and still talks about it. You're like,
yeah, except he's 57.
Exactly. Yeah. You're like, you're working at a gas station wearing your Letterman's jacket. It's time to move on. So I kind of always been this guy, like put your head down, disciple, lead people to Jesus, you know. So I'm not a revival junkie like some of the people that you probably have met with. But it is a community that has seen God uniquely move and a community that contends for God to move like that again.
Right.
There's professors that were students during the 1970 revival that now are professors at the seminary or the university. Like that changes something. So you have that context. Plus you have the squeeze of racial tensions, the squeeze of COVID, the squeeze of being a liberal arts Christian college. So it kind of felt primed in some ways. And then in my own life, I had been in a very difficult season. My wife and I had just lost our middle daughter, only a couple, almost not even 2 years before this encounter.
I'm so sorry. How old was she, Zach?
We just had a little bit of time with her, but we got to spend about a day with her before she went to be with the Lord.
So sorry.
But did not expect to only have a day, of course. But so we're still in grief. So God's forming in Kristen and I and crystallizing some things in us. And the university is experiencing that. And, you know, my story, I'm about an hour away or 3 hours away doing ministry the night before. While there's a unique experience on Asbury's campus facilitated by the president and a pastor called a witnessing circle. And this witnessing circle was a act of racial reconciliation on campus, that there was a pastor that came and read the deeds of slave owners in Wilmore, Kentucky. And there was this moment of asking for forgiveness, receiving forgiveness that ended in this moment of worship. And the Spirit's presence was very uniquely there. That was the night before February 8th, everyone knows about. The night before, there's this unbelievably gorgeous step towards reconciliation on campus that then flowed into gospel choir practicing in Hughes Auditorium until early hours of the night before chapel the next day. So I come as a guest preacher, and there's already something that is stirring on campus. But that chapel service is a mandatory chapel service of about 1,000 students. And I preach, and you get some laughs and you get some whatever. And I didn't feel a unique wind of the Spirit as I was preaching. In fact,
what was the music like prior to your sermon?
It was the gospel choir, which was beautiful.
Fine.
You know, and And
fine. But you've been to a million of those or 100 of those. Yeah.
If you've seen Hughes Auditorium, it's not, the state of the art kind of, the chairs, some of them will give you splinters. They're old and creaky, and people have their hoods up and AirPods in, like it is what it is.
Because it's mandatory chapel. Yeah. We all know what that's like. Yeah.
Yeah. So I ran out of time, click through my last 6 or 7 slides and point to the last slide of we were talking about authentic love. So we have to experience authentic love of God vertically before we can authentically love horizontally. I get off stage after praying. I text my wife that it didn't go very well and that I would be home soon for a nap. That was exhausted. And 40 minutes later, I send her a video of the 19 students that stayed.
So 19 stayed, not 1,000, not 100, no. 19. So you're at 1.9% of the 1,000 students stayed behind. Okay. And
they kind of all moved towards the front, towards the altar. And I'm not even at that point, excited about what's going on. I'm ready to go home to take a nap. And
why were you still in the room?
I told them that I would stay. It's not even a spiritual reason. I told, I think I've over reps have seen that Gen Z will respond and could use time to pray and process with someone. But ultimately I had coffee at 1:30 and I told them I would stay if they wanted until 1:30. And then 1:30 comes along and I tell that person, hey, you should come to Asbury and bring your guitar because God's doing something uniquely. And then about 4 hours later, I voice memo my wife weeping to get the girls out of daycare and get them to Asbury because God seemingly is in the room in a way I've never experienced before. And within about 3 days, it had been, I believe at the time, the fastest hashtag to 1 billion.
Wow.
And we started seeing international guests within about 3 days. And then, 16 days later, our conservative guess is around 80,000 people had convened spontaneously. 1,800 volunteers had volunteered spontaneously. We never went hungry. We never went without porta potties. And the last night, God had already orchestrated Collegiate Day of Prayer to be on campus. 2 years prior, they signed contracts. And because of that, we had the means to broadcast the last evening, and close to 5 million people watched as we catalyzed what God had started at Asbury, and we grieved and rested and then kind of commissioned about 4 of us from Asbury to travel and tell the stories and encourage. And I get to be one of them. And so
I want to rewind because I think there are pastors who kind of long for it after Asbury. You were mentioning that there's definitely a presence on campus where some of the people who remember can be maybe a little hyper obsessed with it or living in the past. I picked up online with some of the dialogue that people are really longing for it, and which is good, and maybe even trying to manufacture it or hey, was that revival? There are those little tenets, and I'm not a cynic. Hey, God is moving right now, and that was a really powerful thing. And I remember writing a post because people were, well, is this real? And it's let's just assume it's real, okay? And so I'm not coming at this critically or cynically, but what I want to do, and I haven't studied revival like others have studied revival, but I want to know, as you were preparing your message, was it just one of the many messages you were going to give that year? Was there anything special you felt in the prep? Anything different you did? You mentioned the racial reconciliation that happened the night before, which you weren't a part of because you were somewhere else. That was special. But in your prep, what was different?
Yeah, I think, to be really honest, and it's actually become quite a bit of our ministry, my personal testimony over the last 2 years, is I didn't feel anything special. And
Yeah, that's what I suspected.
I remember feeling a moment on stage that I felt directed to specifically address inauthentic love. And I think Gen Z, the people in the room, have experienced an immense amount of inauthentic love in the context of authentic love. I remember feeling the Spirit direct me there in a way that I normally wouldn't. But the passage that I've been clinging to, that I would encourage anyone who does preach and is longing to see a movement of God, is this passage from Paul when he writes to the Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 2, he says, "When I came to you, I didn't come with sophistication of speech or worldly wisdom, forgetting everything besides Christ crucified, with fear, trembling, and weakness. So there would be a demonstration of the Spirit of God, and not in the sophistication of my speech, so that you would have confidence in God and its power, and not in man." And I think God is doing something, not that we would dumb down our preparation or not be diligent, but I think we're starting to see when we, approach something begging for a demonstration of God's Spirit and not a demonstration of my sophistication of speech and worldly wisdom, that God is uniquely showing up. And, but God will do whatever he wants, wherever he wants, with whoever he wants. And so I don't want to lay claim to that I have some secret sauce in my prep.
Right. So but I mean, that is a beautiful verse, a great verse. I'm sure a lot of the preachers listening have preached that verse, but was that your text that day? Like, you didn't go in thinking anything special was going to happen. It was just, there's never just another message, but it was just another message, right?
Yeah. I was preaching out of Romans 12, 9 through 21. Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, I love that text. I think I could spend the rest of my life in Romans chapter 12 and still not master it. Okay. You said you had a little bit of a inclination that you needed to speak about inauthentic love, but that was it. And then, you texted your wife, "This one wasn't so good. It was a stinker," I think was a direct quote.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've all been there. Less than 2% of the students stay behind. You just stayed because you were supposed to stay and you promised you would. What was different about those 19 students? Or was there anything different?
Well, I have to give them props that I think they're hungry. I think God's doing something on hungry and humble people.
Yeah. So play the scene. What were they doing? Were they just sitting there praying? Did they come to the front? Did they ask for prayer? Like, just those of us who weren't there, what happened?
Yeah. So they slowly moved towards the front, and some of the choir stayed behind and continued to lead in worship, and they just sat and sang. There was at one point a group of them went and knelt at the altar, and then within about an hour, we start seeing more and more people walk back into chapel.
And were people texting people, or how did the word spread? Okay.
Yeah, people were texting, and then there's stories of there's these 4 young men that just went and ran around campus and busted into classrooms and said that God was moving on chapel. And then around 4:00 in the afternoon, the president sent an email to campus. I remember sitting with Dr. Kevin Brown. He's a guy that is worth you connecting with, Carey. Okay. Dr. Kevin Brown is just, it's unbelievable. But sitting with him and really wrestling with, like, do I send an email to faculty and students that something's happening? And he did. And by that evening, chapel was full. Students from University of Kentucky were there, just up the road, other campuses. And that evening, another gentleman who would be good for you to connect with, Dr. David Thomas, is a mentor of mine. I had called him to come just process a little bit. And I remember standing in the basement of Hughes Auditorium with a couple of the vice presidents, the president, David, and I, considering what would it look like to keep chapel open.
And how many people were there at this time, and what was going on?
It was probably about 1,300 people had come back.
So it was flooded.
Yeah. And At that time, I had preached again, I think twice. We had seen a couple people come to Christ. We had hours, about 2 hours of people just sharing testimony, times of confession, a public reading of scripture. It was not sparkly and it was quite clunky, but that evening when we kind of discerned that God might be doing something, let's keep chapel open. Mm-hmm. And I came upstairs and got to announce that we were going to keep it open. The room cheered and lots of students left to go get mattresses and pillows, and they were going to stay the night. And that ended up being the case for about 16 days.
So in those first few hours, did anything shift inside you? And if so, what? Can you describe it?
Yeah, the first couple hours I started getting envisioned and hopeful. But I would say, and this is honestly just honest, like I wish I was more locked in, but I think we've said as a team the first day or two, we just didn't say no. We just were curious enough to not say no. And then it was about day 3 or 4 when we said the yes, like the yes to sophisticating our leadership team, the yes to probably figuring out safety and lines and feeding schedules and starting to have to say yes. It was about that weekend. So the first couple hours, I think I was getting hopeful and I was honored to be in the seat I was in. But it wasn't until probably a day or 2 later that I was like, it was time to lead. It was time to steward a unique movement of God. And the first day or so, I was just kind of buzzing and curious,
Tell us what God did in your view over those 16 days. What kinds of things? And again, we've all read the reports. Most of us weren't there. What did you see happening in the room?
I saw God minister to a room and how he beautifully and intentionally and very personally ministers to people. He ministers to you very different than he probably ministers to me. And that's the joy of who we serve. But he moved in such a way that I think it captivated Gen Z in a unique way. And it captivated their imaginations to what, if this is what God could do, we're in. And the other generations got to observe and be strengthened and encouraged. But I think what we saw at Asbury and what we've seen since is a generation is now envisioned with this authentic presence of God that uniquely ministers to their needs, not as consumers, but you think about like the peace we experience at Asbury for a generation that is just riddled with anxiety, or the joy in a generation that struggles with depression, or a huge part of what I've discerned is we experience his humility and kindness in a context where most narratives is like pride and harshness in the church. And one thing that was really unique was about a week in, we had to discuss as leaders, so many people were just meeting each other and having these kind of ruckus, joyful, laughing conversations. And it felt irreverent to what was happening in the room, that we were like, do we need to like tell people like, hey, if you want to just visit, you have to leave? And some of that probably, it's like the manifest presence of God is in the room. Don't just come and like visit, But then we realized, someone said, they're like, we have such a lonely generation. We are such a lonely people. We're all stuck to our phones and that's how we connect. That maybe that is even a movement of God's Spirit, that we're connecting strangers and they're enjoying each other. So we saw so many of these countercultural kind of confrontational manifestations of God to a culture. And that's what he does, I think, when his presence comes, is he confronts. And And we don't like the word confrontation because that feels like raising a voice or being harsh, but Jesus' character and confrontation can hold hands and be at the same time. I think he confronted us in the ways that we need to be confronted and then envisioned for something bigger.
Can you say more about how God, the Holy Spirit, confronted you?
Yeah. I love this idea of confrontation comes from this book called Invitation to a Journey.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this really simple sub point in like one of the first chapters is, if we want to be made more like Jesus, of course we're going to experience confrontation in the parts that are the most unlike Jesus. Almost like the transparency layered on another transparency. When they don't line up, it doesn't make sense. So if I have Jesus' profile and my life and characteristics and experience don't line up with that, then those are the points of confrontation. So he confronts out of his love for me to be formed into his likeness. He confronts me in the areas where I'm the most unlike him. And the Holy Spirit confronted me and my wife often during those 16 days. We were still processing and grieving the loss of our daughter, Esther. And there was a moment, the first couple of days, my wife didn't really engage with what was happening because part of her journey was just an immense amount of grief and lots of valid, hard questions. And there was a moment where I think this cadence of confrontation in God's presence had led to this moment of breakthrough in my wife's life. That they had given me an office upstairs, and I had come downstairs because I had heard my daughter and wife had arrived. And I come through the doors and I see my wife worshiping and dancing with my daughter. And we had been confronted and conformed into what Jesus wanted us to look like. And my wife's never been the same. That's confrontation. We're afraid of confrontation, but even like me, I can struggle a lot with pride, which presents in me being intimidated in fear of man. That's still pride though. And I was confronted in this of saying, well, Zach, for some apparent reason, you're chosen to be preaching that day. So you're going to step up and lead and be yourself, or you're going to shrink back because why did he pick you? Why didn't he pick John Tyson, who studies this, or Luke Lefevre, who's unbelievable? Or why didn't he pick David Thomas, who studied this with his whole life, or my pastor Austin, who is obsessed with prayer rooms and he's like a GQ model? Why did he pick me? Well, I don't know, but I was confronted and I could step up with consecrated confidence and be myself. But we have to place ourselves in a place to be confronted. And I think that's what's happening. I think we're seeing God confront students on, through the Unite Us movement. I think we see God confronting the disunity and the short-sightedness through movements like Gather 25. I think ultimately your podcast, they're just cadence of confrontations on different topics. Someone's teaching something and it's confronting probably the listener in a way that they can either be like, oh, I don't like that, like an itchy sweater or a pebble in their shoe. Or they could deal with it because maybe it's a good confrontation and they'll look more like Jesus by the time they're done listening to your podcast.
It's a good metaphor, man. All of my growth comes out of confrontation, and that can be gentle. Sometimes it can be extremely painful, deeply harsh. You mentioned that, and I want to make sure I got this right, so please nuance it however you want, but it sounded like you were hinting at that God seemed to be dealing with Gen Z differently than older generations, than millennials or Gen X or boomers who might have been in the room, because of course, started as a Gen Z thing. And did you say 80,000 people made it through Asbury before it was over 16 days later? So you got all the generations there. First of all, is that accurate? And secondly, how was it different generationally?
Yeah, it is accurate. And we decided early on to prioritize Gen Z. So we even had two lines. We had a line for 25 and younger and another line for 25 and older. And we got some beef for that.
You got an express line for 25 and under? Wow.
Yeah. And at one point, Hughes was pretty much only 25 and younger because we had so many other people, and we really felt like God was trying to do something with that generation.
What made you do that? What made you sense that?
We discerned that as a team. It wasn't Zach's decision. The team moved from me and a few others to about 7 of us. And then that sophisticated to a team of about 14, with then 2 concentric circles smaller. And we just continued to discern that this seemingly was for our students and the students that were coming. We had over 300 college campuses and universities represented during those 16 days.
Wow.
One of my favorite pictures, we had this big whiteboard, and it was, if you're a college student, come and write down the university. And I remember seeing Yale, Harvard, UC, Santa Barbara, CSU, SEC schools, community colleges, international schools. So we just discerned that. And what was really awesome was there was like little to no pushback on that. I remember this one time I was at the front of the line, and there's this couple that had waited in for 8 hours with their son who had just got out of rehab. And their son was under 25 and they weren't. And it was like, I just had to get my young son to the altar. And they like dropped their son off. He went straight to the altar, and then they went to another venue to just wait and pray for their son. There just seemingly was a grace on it. And I think one thing that was really beautiful was that other generations were getting called to be spiritual fathers and mothers, being called to be spiritual brothers and big brothers and sisters. And realize, like, for some of them, it's not about you anymore.
Yeah, definitely.
But it was also a good rebuke and challenge for Gen Z to be like, hey, look at this room. Look at this little town that has been invaded by spiritual big brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers that are here for you.
You're not alone.
And in Malachi, it says the fathers will turn to the sons and sons will turn to the fathers. So there's even times where I would co-teach with my mentor who is in his 60s and I'm 35. And we would challenge, hey, if you're under 25, go find someone that is older than you and pray over them. And you return the favor. And it was like breathing on coals whenever that stuff happened. You know what I mean? And if you talk to some of our friends that are just unbelievable worship leaders, they had not been led in the presence. I remember talking to one of our friends who said, I miss worshiping led by like 18-year-olds who can't really play that instrument, but the purity of their heart. And that was a confrontation. There were some of our dear friends that sat in that room and wept. But if you knew the rooms that they lead worship in, you would never think that, And I actually pulled up this quote that I laugh about all the time, Carey. I can't tell you exactly who posted this but he is a Grammy award-winning musical artist. The Gen Z students had no clue who he was. I remember noticing that they had put this guy on the djembe, like a little box drum or tone. And this guy leads from the piano. And this is what he posts. He says, I've been at the Asbury Revival for 4 hours. They put me on cajon with the emoji of him crying and laughing. One Gen Z worship leader, after every song he played, would completely stop cold turkey for about a minute. While everyone in the room was awkwardly waiting, he'd turn to us and say, well, what song do we want to do next? I offered to help, but he told me that a little time or a little quiet never hurt anyone. He says, there is no showmanship whatsoever. And then he writes this, I'm convinced that in one of the darkest, most self-absorbed times in human history, God is raising up Gen Zers who will be marked by humility. In meekness, they will braid whips and drive out circus shows of the church. They will overturn tables of exaggeration and celebrity Christianity. And nameless and faceless army will make God's house a true house of prayer. That's a confrontation.
Yep. No, that is interesting. If you have a bit of a profile in the church, the audience is so fractionalized now with Gen Z. I'm sure a lot of Gen Z have no idea what I do, or you could name the leaders of the 10 largest churches in the US, and Gen Z's like, who? And that's not a bad thing. That is not a bad thing. What you said that God was moving differently in the generation, so there's confrontation, but then when it came to Gen Z, what did you see happening? Jenny Allen talks about confession, and JP Pokluda talk about confession being such a big part of it. Was that there? What was going on with Gen Z? Because on the one hand, it was affirming, right? Like you're not alone, you're deeply loved by the Father. What was going on?
Yeah, definitely confession. I think there's a real awareness of brokenness in Gen Z, because we've all told them how broken they are, but also they feel broken. They feel anxious. They know it. So when we create ecosystems where it's safe for them to be honest, and we as leaders will also be honest, they're like, oh, if you're going to go there, I'll go there. So there was an immense amount of confession, but there was also an immense amount of courage for them to share things. And there was also an immense amount of courage for them to step up and lead. You know, during those 16 days, we had some people preach their first sermon ever in front of 80,000 people. Or the night that 4.9 million people tuned in, a sophomore in college preached the message. And I stayed up till 4 a.m. at Waffle House the day before. You know, and there was a courage. But when you behold Jesus, when his presence falls and you behold Jesus, you confess and you have courage. Isaiah 6. Presence. Woe is me. I'm a man of unclean lips. Hey, who will I send? Send me. Mm-hmm. Confession and courage. It's honestly a lot of what you're talking about is this retreat and revival, this like retreat of like stepping. I'm like, oh, I don't know if I want to be a part of this, but then also this revived courage to step forward. And we saw it, you know, so many innovations and solutions brought to us by Gen Z during those days.
I want to come back to that. You used an interesting phrase, creating ecosystems for people to be honest. What does that look like? I mean, in many respects, just to frame this up, if you look at how 98% of us are leading church these days who are listening to this show, that would be like, well, Sunday morning, you know, there's not a lot of confession going on. There's not a lot of vulnerability. That's for community group. Hopefully it happens there. Who knows whether it's happening there? But where do you create ecosystems for people to be honest?
Yeah, I think if I could be so bold, I would ask the question, who convinced you that has to happen in community groups?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I have not led large churches, but I did plant and pastor a church for a while, and I've worked with church planners for quite a while. And what I love about the ability to ask that question is you really kind of, I think one thing that we're seeing since Asbury, like in our friends in London, like one of our dear friends, Al Gordon. I just want to give him a shout out because Al Gordon.
Love Al.
Al has humbly put pretty much his entire scorecard of what is a success on the altar and said, Jesus, am I after the right things? And I think that's kind of that question. It's like, who told you that has to happen in 10 to 12 people in a living room and not in your preaching? Who told you that has to happen in one-on-one pastoral care counseling and not in the response time? And I think through some of the things in my life, and I know you've been very open with some of your story, Carey, it kind of crystallizes this like, and this is who we are. This is how, and by God's grace is enough. And Gen Z sees us doing that and they'll step in if we'll go there. So if we create this ecosystem of honesty and authenticity with good boundaries, right? You're not going to throw your pearls to swine. You're not going to throw holy things to dogs like Matthew 7 instructs us. Yeah. So I don't share the same ththings from stage that I do in my accountability group.
Yeah.
But I do want to create an ecosystem of authenticity and honesty that the people that watch are like, if he's not put together, I don't have to be put together. And if I'm shiny on stage, they actually believe the lie. They have to be shiny in the seats. But if I don't have to be impressive on stage, but just be faithful, then they actually don't really have to be impressive in the seats and just be faithful. And that's this ecosystem that we're seeing, not just during those 16 days at Asbury, but I think we're starting to see around the church and around the globe. I've seen it as I've traveled. It gets me really excited.
You know, they were on the podcast a few months ago, but, you know, when you really look at the life and ministry of Jenny Allen and JP Pokluda, you mentioned Unite Us. That's a characteristic for both of them. They're pretty transparent about what's right and what's wrong in their lives. And very recent history, not like 30 years ago, you know, it's more like yesterday. I think that's right from the front. But I'm wondering if you can rewind the film a little bit to the first day, the first hours when because you were there firsthand, when you remember confession happening for the first time. How did that happen? How did it not just become worship fest or preach offs or how did confession become a really big part of what happened at Asbury?
Yeah, we go back to beholding, right? So when you behold Jesus, you confess, right? Yeah. So there's something about worship leads to confession or presence. But it started actually with a student asking to share his testimony.
Okay.
That was the first time. And that guy, a student, he was a senior that year or junior that year. Charlie stepped up and shared his testimony about how both of his parents had died in a car accident the semester before, and that he was really scared and intimidated, and people rallied around and prayed for him. And then another girl stepped up and testified to feeling invisible and desiring to commit suicide. And I remember hearing from the balcony someone just screaming, "I see you. You're not invisible." And all these people just rushed to the stage and started praying for this girl. And then I remember saying, okay, we're going to step on stage. And this is how clunky it was, Carey. I stepped on stage and said, okay, we're not going to air our dirty laundry, but we're going to step into a time of confession, stand up and say, I confess this. And then the whole room will say, Christ's blood covers your sin. And I remember this is it's kind of funny, but also beautiful. Like, students stepped up, confessed. We all said, Christ's blood covers your sin. And then a professor stands up and confesses to something that, like, you could feel in the room, like, how are we going to respond? Is this going to take the air out of the room? Because that's a professor. And the room says it before I could lead it. And does that make sense? Like,
yeah. So how did the room respond? Like,
they just said it. Like, they just said, Christ's blood covers your sin. And then the next person moved on, because it was like, and then in that moment, I remember a couple times later, I was like, hey, we're going to have some pastors come up front. If you do confess to something that you need some coaching, come up front. I have some local pastors up to my front and my right. But it was just this quick innovation in the moment. And we just went on, and it went on for like a little over an hour.
Wow.
And then we moved into a time of silence. And then we rolled back into worship. So there was kind of these like moving puzzle pieces that we move around of scripture read aloud, confession aloud, stories. And we just we met every about 3 hours. And something that we talked a lot about is we're not like, I wrote this in my notes just so I could say it. Like, I remember continually having to remind myself, it's not time to exert, it's time to examine. It's not time to put my hands on this. It's time for me to put eyes on it. It's not time to me direct. It's time for me to listen. It's time for me to observe and then lead. I had to continue to remember myself, because I can QB a situation. I can lead. But it was like this time that was almost too delicate and holy to just pull out my leadership book I read and just start leading. So
How did you, and perhaps the team as time went on, how did you discern that? Because I think stewarding that moment, you guys didn't really have a category for it or a recent precedent for it. It's not like this happened
Yeah.
last year somewhere else. How did you discern that in the moment?
Yeah, I think one thing that was really clear was it was in plurality.
Mm-hmm.
So we had we had different gifts and perspectives. We had different generations represented. And we really just didn't want to get in the way.
Mm-hmm.
So we really kind of felt like, shepherds or kind of trying to, when it was time to exert, it was more like a tap than like a big push. It was like, we need to get just a little bit this way, a little bit this way, because we weren't the primary person exerting ourselves. It was God was presenting himself, and we were steering and kind of tapping here and tapping there. And we would do that in team pretty ruthlessly. And we would, if someone stepped out of that, we would be pretty open with them that couldn't happen again. Yeah. I remember like the third or fourth day, something happened and I just jumped on stage and led it. And I was quickly rebuked by the team because that's not how we were doing it.
That was a little too, aggressive?
Bullish. Yeah, bullish or aggressive. It was just like, it wasn't evil. It wasn't sinful. It just, we had decided how we were going to lead, and that wasn't how we were leading.
So you mentioned testimony. I think a lot of pastors are terrified of that, getting audience participation, so to speak, congregational participation. Obviously, that was catalytic in the event, catalytic to Gen Z. Did you have to moderate it to the point where people were being inappropriate with what they were sharing? I mean, I just want to ask the question everybody's thinking in the back of their mind. Yeah. Because they're thinking, if we do that on Sunday, we're going to get all the people who shouldn't be speaking, and the people who we would want to speak are probably going to sit back. What were the dynamics involved in that?
Yeah, so one practical thing and then one more theoretical thing. I think the theoretical thing is still asking the question, what is our primary priority today? Is it the sainthood of all believers and we're willing to pay the tax of something happening a little bit awkward? Because that's just what we do in community. We pay the tax. So I want to continue to point us back to like, let's ask that question. Let's continue to ask that question. But practically, one of my teammates, Jess Avery, had a great thing. She said, we would announce there's the ABCDs of testimony, and we would hold the mic. They wouldn't hold the mic. We would hold the mic, and they would visit with someone before they got to get on stage. Or we actually didn't let them on stage. They would come up front. And the ABCDs, A was all about Jesus. B, be brief. C was current. It wasn't, hey, this happened when I was 7. It was like, this is what God's doing now. And D, don't preach. And we held the mic, and they needed to follow the rules of ABCD. And if they didn't, we would lead the situation.
But how often did that happen? Where you had to kind of pull the mic away or cut them off?
I remember like 3 times.
Oh, wow. In 16 days, that's not bad. There's probably more fear, and I appreciate the guidelines. By the way, if you're ever doing a Q&A, hold the mic. Don't give it to the person asking the question. That's a really good idea. And then I guess you set a tone and people kind of know, oh, this is how we do it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you curate culture too. If you're a church leader, you could see this as creating culture that you're willing to linger in worship. You're creating culture that people could preach for the first time, or in some of you're creating culture that people could testify and were willing to pay the tax of the awkwardness or the fumble, because the ultimate goal is to be the church, not to entertain.
So this goes on for 16 days. How did you decide that you were going to, the first night you kind of described we're going to stay open overnight, but was there the temptation to say, okay, it's been 24 hours, guys, we're going to shut this down? Like, how did you navigate those dynamics, get that discernment and then I want to get to a second part of the question, which is, why 16 days? I remember that announcement coming out because everyone's like, is this going to go on for a month? Like, what's going on? Yeah. But let's talk about just the first few days. What was the thought process behind leaving it open to continue?
Yeah, I think one thing that was really beautiful about Asbury and then the team that was built was we just had a level of faith and imagination of what this could be. Mm-hmm. And it seemingly was confirmed by people we trusted and called upon, and seemingly confirmed by the community in which it was happening within, that this was a unique outpouring of God's Spirit. And we would meet almost every 3 hours. We would take about 6 hours off at night and all sleep. But then we would meet about every 3 hours. And it would feel awkward because, thousands and thousands and thousands were waiting in line, and we would ask the question, are we still going? And yeah, we're supposed to, and then, transitioning to catalyzing after 16 days, a lot of that was processing the fact that we had limits. Asbury University is chartered to be a university and not an event venue. And in Wilmore, Kentucky, has 2 stoplights and a Subway restaurant, a Chinese restaurant. Like, the police began to ask us, hey, how long is this going to last? Plumbing started to break in the little town. People weren't able to find parking, so they would just pull into people's yards and ruin their yards.
Wow.
What's awesome and what I've had to learn in the last 2 years is God is not frustrated with my limits. He's created me to be a human, not a superhero. And as soon as during the Asbury Outpouring, I was still very human. All of us were very human. And the city was still a city with a university with students that needed to eat and go to class. And we had about 20 students that didn't leave their dorms the entire time because they were so afraid.
Really?
And
just afraid of the crowds, afraid of...
Yeah. And the reality is the crowds don't understand that this is a university. Not all of them did. Crowds didn't understand that that's a girls' dorm and those bathrooms aren't for you. We don't think about that stuff. But yeah. I think that's one reason why Kevin Brown, the president, is one of the greatest leaders I have witnessed in adaptive leadership and godly integrity, to stand up in it and continue to meet with his faculty and say, are we in? Like, he would have these regular State of the Unions, or almost like town halls with his faculty, and be like, I need to know if you're in. Because if you're in, we're going. And when we're done, I'll make the hard call. And when all that kind of combined and we realized that we needed to do something different, we explored about 5 options. One of them being catalyzing at the Cleveland Day of Prayer. One of it was moving to a campground and getting a tent. One of it was continuing as is. One of it was to move to a church. And one of it was doing like a Wednesday and Friday night service. And we prayed and fasted as a team. And I remember that. I'll never forget that meeting, all of us coming together and just...
Take us there. What happened?
Yeah, it was this really holy moment with an immense amount of grief that almost like we were saying bye to a unique thing that none of us really wanted to say bye to, but all of us were so exhausted. And we really, really trusted the constituted authority who was hosting us, and that was Asbury University. And Asbury University was going to make the best decision for what they have been chartered and asked to do. And that's to raise up the next generation of academic excellence and spiritual vitality as a university. And I'm really proud of Asbury. I think they made the right decision. I'm really proud of Kevin Brown and his team. I still really miss it. I sit in Hughes Auditorium often and pray. But I think we've seen that Asbury was part of the story of what God's doing in the world. And it is not the story.
Yeah.
Very much not. And we had to allow that.
What was the reaction when you announced? Because I remember announcing that it's going to end at such and such a time, and we're going to go back to regularly scheduled programming, so to speak. What was the reaction you had, not online, but in the room and in real life?
The students were very grateful and excited. Almost all pretty positive. I think there was a level of grief. I remember meeting people who had flown across the world and got there a day late.
Just got there, and then it's like, and they're shutting down.
Yeah. I remember one night we had started closing for a couple hours at night too, so we could clean. And I remember one night I locked up. I was the last person in the room, and I walked around, and there's like hundreds of people waiting. And they didn't hear that we had been closed for the night.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a good counselor to process all that. But at the same time, it was more positive than negative, and we all held each other accountable to stay off the internet for a little while.
Yeah. No, that's fair. I mean, this is the thing, right? These are, and I'm thank you for the very humane storytelling around this, because we can think of it in very, docetic terms where the spirit floats above the body, but we are tremendously fused as human beings, and the spirit is somehow infused with this body, and this body makes mistakes, right?
Yeah.
So I get that. When you sit in the Hughes Auditorium now, what happens? How do you process? What do you feel?
Yeah, I can only speak for me.
Sure.
Now, I do think the spiritual temperature in Hughes Auditorium and on campus is absurd in a good way.
Mm.
And you're seeing amazing things going on. I'm there. The best way to put it is like, you remember when you go to you smell something that reminds you of grandma's house?
Yeah, ivory dish soap every time.
Yeah, mm-hmm. There you go. Or this is funny. I was just in Orlando, and I feel like Orlando water has a certain smell.
It does, actually. Now that you mention it, it does.
That I'm but that always reminds me of when I went to Disney World with my dad before he part of my story is he kind of left us. So I remember Disney. So I was just at Disney World, and I'm smelling that, and it reminds me of those memories. When I'm in Hughes, it's just like seeing grandma's house or tasting that water in Orlando.
Something beautiful happened here.
And something unique too is I actually have so much. I can pray with level 10 faith in Hughes.
Oh, that you wouldn't get sitting where you are right now.
Yeah, I'm in the basement of my house. There's something about stepping into Hughes Auditorium that I'm Jesus will come back.
You can do anything.
Will be saved. Because there's something about going back to that place where I saw tumors disappear and people get out of wheelchairs. And we got a Zoom call one day from missionaries that had come to Asbury and had gone back to Indonesia and then went into an unreached people group, led them to the Lord. And I sat in Hughes and got that call. So there's actually some of our good friends, mutual friends, that are going through something, processing something. And just the other day, I prayed for them in Hughes and sent them a picture. And there's just something about a place where they met God, where I met God, and we in that can join together with an immense amount of faith because we saw Jesus show up there. That I have a lot of faith. I joke that, in Numbers 13 and 14, there's 12 spies that saw the land, and 10 came back with one report, and 2 came back with another, even though they saw the same thing.
Yes.
And I just feel like the church has heard 10 spy reports for too long. And when I sit in Hughes, I am a 2 spy. Like, my report is, let's go. Like, let's go. And you can think so many things about whatever God's doing, but I'm just going to be one of the 2 spies. And when I'm in Hughes Auditorium, or when I'm preaching in Hughes Auditorium, when I'm with university students right now, I just feel like one of the 2 spies. And
that's cool.
Yeah.
Tumors and wheelchairs. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think it was, I saw things that I've never seen before. And one of my favorite stories is we had this basketball player who was kind of bad news, and he was pretty much still on our campus because he was really good at basketball. And
sure. Fair enough. Say no more.
And he just sat in that room for days, not a believer, but sat in that room for days because his girlfriend was a believer. And he ends up giving his life to the Lord and walking out of the room and running into a man in a wheelchair with some tumors that you could see around his face. And this basketball player he tells his story. He's like, I grabbed my girlfriend and I had seen it happening, and now I was a believer, so I can pray for him. And he prayed for this guy, and this guy was healed. And
like, visibly, his face is different.
Visibly, tumors disappear. He's out of his wheelchair. And this is a basketball player who had known Jesus for 30 minutes and had been. And the thing that I've been preaching and dreaming, and I would love to challenge anyone who's listening, is like, that guy did not know better. He just didn't know better. And so many of us know better all of a sudden. Like, oh, we can't do that because I know better. Well, look what happens when a room doesn't know better. Like Luke 18 says, hey, no, don't push away the children, disciples. You actually have to be like them to come into the kingdom. So it was something like when we experienced God, we just didn't know better. So then we started praying in ways that we hadn't prayed. And we didn't have this level of cynicism so we saw people get out of wheelchairs, and we saw people's stutters disappear, and we saw someone healed from Tourette's. We saw spontaneously $80,000 given after the student gave a testimony that he couldn't get home. And I remember someone in the balcony yells out, "Hey, dude!" And he throws something at the student, and I'm like, "Oh, it's all done." Like, this is the worst. Like, I
this
remember,
is bad.
And it was a wad of cash, and it spontaneously turned into almost 10 minutes of people at all 7 venues at that time bringing money to the front, and we collected it. We just didn't know better.
There's beauty to that. Uneducated, inarticulate ordinary men.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think when you're in the presence of God, you restore some childlikeness,
Yeah.
And so, yeah, when I'm in Hughes, I start thinking, what if a little bit more,
I love that. Yeah. And that's a great, you mentioned confrontation. That's a great confrontation for someone like me, very rational. Let's talk about Aftereffects, Afterglow. I want to talk about you, but let's talk about the students first, particularly Gen Z. If you look at the metadata, since I wrote that piece on Gen Z being in revival and retreat, New York Times, Pew Research, numerous headlines showing that the decline in the church has reversed in Christianity in the last couple of years. And that's super encouraging. I want to be all over that. Yet you look at Gen Z and church attendance actually until, as far as I know right now, has been declining, not increasing. So you see that revival, this really powerful move of God. But on the meta level, there's 70 million Gen Z. Not all of them are coming to faith. But among those who are at Asbury, what are you seeing 2 and a bit years later now?
Yeah, I think a maturation, like a maturing of, okay, my life cannot be like those 16 days for the rest of my life. So what does that mean? Yeah. What does that mean? Like, I had a conversation with 3 athletes yesterday who were all present at the Outpouring, who all of them are struggling with dating relationships and purity. Like, they didn't worry about that during the Outpouring, but they do now.
Yes.
But they remember some of the things that were deposited, and but we also have students. We've sent over 100 teams all over the world to testify. We have people who have become missionaries and pastors, and who knows what 10, 20 years from now we're going to hear about from them. So there's a maturation of, like, okay, what does this mean now in ordinary life? What does it mean that, one of my good friends, he was a student during the Outpouring, led worship quite a bit during the Outpouring, now leads worship at a 3-campus church in, I believe, Mississippi. And he's asking very practical questions on how to apply what he experienced at Asbury and the worship services that he stewards. Like, those are just really great questions.
And how is it going? Have you seen churches? I mean, I've written about it. Lots of people have written about it, talked about it. Have you seen churches embrace some of the principles about Asbury? Yeah. What do you see? Yeah,
I see. I was just at a beautiful church in Orlando who is really kind of in the midst of a 10-day visitation. That worship is just intense, and they're hungry to linger in worship.
Can you say which church?
Yeah, Life Bridge. It's going to be transitioned. It's becoming Key Church, led by Luke Lazan.
Luke Lazan. I was going to say, I figured you were talking about Luke. Yeah.
Yeah, but if you haven't heard, that church is really under a unique visitation. And there is a level of the fear of God that they won't name it, and they're not posting about it. But I got to sit with their staff and be like, this smells like Grandma's house. I've smelled Grandma's house. This smells like Grandma's house. And you're seeing people go there, or you're seeing, like, Al Gordon is a great example. That church was probably the coolest looking church you've ever been to. And he is the pinnacle of creativity and production. And he is now pursuing presence and prayer. And he has lost staff members. He's paid the cost. You hear about what happened at Saddleback recently.
Yeah. I'm
for a
talking
church
to
like
Andy about that, and Luke. Yeah.
It's unbelievable. Or what John Tyson and Sam Gibson are doing in New York City. Or we're just seeing the church respond. There's a church in Lexington that I think probably is like the white hot core of people who were there during the Outpouring. It's called First Alliance. And the pastors there were wrecked at the Outpouring. And to see how the presence is stewarded at a beautiful family church in the suburbs of Lexington, Kentucky, you'd think, so I see it in the church. I see it on campuses. I see it among leaders. I love sitting with leaders who, are some of the greatest musicians and communicators that are now asking questions on what their scorecard is. And it's beautiful.
I think it is beautiful. So, Zach, I think you can handle this next line of questioning. Your new book is called Lower. It's about humility. But, there's a sense you preached many times since Asbury. You've been involved in many services. And I think a lot of us would like to be like the New Testament. You just touch the hem of my garment and you'll be healed. But I'm guessing you've done a lot of services that feel much more ordinary than those 16 days that you're prepping, you're praying, you're ready to go. And it's never just another Sunday, but it probably feels like just another Sunday. Can you speak into that tension a little bit, or even that dynamic of like, what do you do when it's never just another service, but I think you know where I'm coming from. Yeah. It's like, well, that was just another service. Like, what is that doing inside you?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think when it comes to like the topic of humility and what we're talking about as we testify is that very step towards self-awareness of okay, I'm going to be faithful because I was invited to speak here. I'll do my prep. I'll be myself. I pray that God would be himself.
Yeah.
And something that's new for me since the outpouring that I adopted during the outpouring is, like many of us who preach regularly, we spend a lot of time in preparation before we preach.
Yeah.
And we probably have some kind of prayer practice before we get on stage. Mm-hmm. And for a long time, I don't know if anybody else would relate, I would get done preaching and I would have no practice after I would preach. I would just be like, I'm ready to go to lunch and take a nap. You know, I do. Yeah. I now am ruthless with a practice before I transition into the rest of my day.
What do you do?
And I ask God, I try to remember every element of my preaching. I'll go through my notes and be like, oh, that hit and I heard amens. Lord, I give you back that. Oh, that joke hit and I really liked how that made me feel. I give you that back. Oh, I said that point and everyone looked at me like, I don't understand what you're trying to say. I give you back my insecurity in that moment.
Wow.
And then what I try to do is if I could leave that building and get on a plane to come home with any crown on my head, I'm not leaving that room until a crown is at his feet. Like that practice right there, I won't really even move on to greeting people after a service until I do that. And then sometimes if I do that and I go to greeting time and someone's like, wow, that was unbelievable. Hey, can I take a picture? I came to Asbury and this is just so cool. Or, hey, I want to buy all these books or whatever. I got to do that practice again because I'm a dad of three little girls, 2 girls at home. I want to be ready for them. I don't want to come in with a bunch of crowns because some stranger said I preach real good. No offense to that person. You know?
Yeah.
But so I give him back my wins in my sermon. I give him back my failures in my sermon. I give him back the laughs and the things that kind of tickled my ego, the high fives after and what that helps me do is I then can go for it. I don't have to subdue my giftedness. So many of us think that humility means subduing our giftedness, when humility is actually what the definition we have in the book is consecrated confidence. It's a confidence that I have gifts. I'm going to consecrate it to the Lord and use my gifts. We would never look at a piano player and be like, you're getting kind of cocky. Can you not be as good at piano? No, you just give it to the Lord. You know, like you and I know some communicators, you being one of them, that are just unbelievably gifted. I don't want you to stop being good at what you do, Carey. I just want you to consecrate it and just don't take any crowns. And if you're really good at what you're good that just means more crowns at his feet. Praise God.
That is so singularly helpful, Zach. Thank you for sharing that. First of all, owned. I don't have a post-sermon routine other than all of those things, the laughs, we don't do amens in our tradition, but if we did, they would be there some Sundays. the applause, the crowd reaction, the people taking notes. I'm owned on this. I'm just confessing live in front of an audience. I would, you said that was a stinker. If all of those things happened in a sermon, I'd come home and I'd tell my wife, I crushed it. I think it went really well. And I might be a little more humble than that, but inside I'm going, I killed that. I want to do that again next time. Let's just be honest about our humanity. And I love the fact that you said, then I can go for it and be myself, because you do want to use all of your gifting. And I've been puzzling over this. I mean, we went to a John Mayer concert a few years ago. I don't know that there's anyone better alive on guitar than John Mayer. Whether you like him or not, he is unbelievable. And I mean, his face is contorted. He leaves it all out there on the stage, pouring his heart out. And I'm reminded of that quote, the glory of God is man fully alive. And, so many of us are held back by, oh, well, that might be too good, or this false humility, or this tempering, or this, I really crushed it. And now it went to my head, all of that. And I think that is such a helpful framing. I am going to adopt that. I think that is really helpful. And thank you for helping me connect some dots on a very relevant topic.
Yeah, well, and I think something that I'm very passionate about is the church has been subdued.
Yes.
Because of our misunderstanding of humility.
Well, you're right. Because if somebody is really good, what do we like to do? We like to shoot them down.
Yeah, right? Instead of just consecrating it. Like the thing is, Carey, is you do crush it. And it's not humility to say, oh no, I didn't do that. In the same way that I am actually pretty good at preaching, I'm realizing.
Mm-hmm.
If not, I wouldn't be invited. I think it would have worn out by now that the Asbury story is out there, right? Now, I don't think I'm the best, but I'm going to be the best I can because I don't muster up that gift. The Lord gave it to me. Mm-hmm. And wouldn't Satan love for the church to be subdued and call it humility when really it's actually being afraid of being prideful or being perceived some way or being canceled. So we should actually be the most vibrant communities because we have the Spirit of the living God inside of us and we are witnessing to God's goodness as missionary disciples. So that's why I love this topic of humility is actually we should be exceptional because it's unto the Lord and consecrated because God gave us it. And
that's such a helpful framing. It really is.
God.
And I think we need it, Zach, because you're right. You can temper your gifting. I had a big birthday earlier this year and I've been thinking, I said to my counselor, I want this decade to be about mastery. And I picked a couple of areas where I really want to master. And he's like, you're already pretty good at that stuff. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I can't, So it's such an awkward thing in the church. We have covered a lot of ground. I barely looked at any questions I sent you ahead of time. So I'm wondering what I'm missing. What have we not covered that we need to cover?
There's so much that I would love to share, and there's so much adoration and respect for you that any conversation I could have, but we got to tell stories about Asbury. We got to talk a little bit about humility. We did write this book coming out of Asbury called Lower, and it ultimately comes from this idea from Andrew Murray's book on humility that he has this quote, "This is the gift to the higher life, lower down, just as rain falls and collects in the lowest places, so that God, when he finds a man empty and abased, can flow in with his grace and power and exalt." That, if the rain is falling, I want it to puddle up in me because I'm a low person. If the rain is falling, I want it to puddle up in our churches because we're low communities. And in a world where we climb in victory and plant our flags, Jesus descends all the way to the cross. And where the world would say that's the lowest point in his life, it is actually biblically the highest pinnacle point of his life until we get to see him around the crown or around the throne. And that's the book. But we got to talk about that. We got to talk about Asbury. We got to talk about Gen Z. I loved it. And I'm just honored to even be a voice in the conversation. So.
Well, that's sort of, it was actually talking to some of the people that we've mentioned so far, Luke Lefevre, and I happened to have dinner with him. And I thought, you know what? We need to hearing about what's happened at Saddleback earlier this year and different things that honestly are happening in real time right now. That's what I want to do this series. And Zach, I can't imagine a better introduction to it. I wasn't there, but I feel like I was there now, thanks to your conversation. Oh, I do have one more question. Yeah, a couple maybe. Do you have a few more minutes?
Of course.
Yeah. I remember the decision about what to call it because when it was breaking out at Asbury, they called it the Asbury Revival. And then your council and perhaps the president decided they were going to call it the Outpouring. Can you explain why it wasn't a revival? I think the other thing was awakening, why the group decided to call it the Outpouring rather than any other choice?
Yeah. So we had a gentleman on our team named Dr. David Thomas who spent a lot of time researching spiritual awakening. And I'll share what he said and what Kevin said. And both of those are great. One is his revival historian is seemingly there's many outpourings that lead to a revival. You speak of revival in the past tense, like seeing, has it really revived something? You look backwards. So we didn't feel like we could say there it is revival. And that's no offense to anyone who's calling other things revival. But we didn't feel like we had the right to call it revival until we saw what would really last.
Sure.
But we saw the rain falling uniquely. So many outpourings lead to revival. Revival sustained leads to global awakening. That's what David Thomas talks about. And Kevin Brown just kind of poked in the balloon to release the pressure and point us to this story. I believe it's in John 9 when the boy was healed from blindness and the Pharisees are trying to like nail it down. Like, is he the Christ? Did he heal you? Like, and the Pharisees are trying to get everyone in trouble to try to name it. And the blind man says, all I know was I was blind and now I see. And this like culture and even religion will try to get us to name it something. And I remember just how the pressure was off when we were like, we could just call it Wednesday. we just know that God showed up in a very unique way. So that's the answer I like. But David Thomas also beautifully kind of paints this picture of multiple outpourings could lead to a revival, seeing if it really does revive something, and then sustained revival might lead to awakening. So we chose the outpouring.
I think that's good to know. I've done videos on this and written about this earlier this year. But another thing that I've seen, and having been in the lead pastor seat and teaching pastor seat for decades, this temptation is real. The temptation, Zach, is to want to bottle it or manufacture it. Manufacture it to get it started. And look, we have a revival too. Look at how full the room was. Look at the salvations. Look at, perhaps you've seen that on social. I think like I've seen that on social from time to time. Or then once you have it, you want to bottle it and recreate it. It's like, and next week we'll be doing this again. So I'm just like confessing as a real human being that those are temptations. And I always tried to draw a line, and I never experienced anything close to, Asbury in all my years of ministry. But, I think about a line between evoking and manipulating. If you're watching a show or a video and it makes you cry, there's two ways that happens. One is you kind of get manipulated. You're like, ugh, and you don't feel good after. You're like, that was cheap or whatever. Another is to evoke. And it takes you back to grandma's house, who you miss so badly, or it takes you back to Disney before your dad left. And the tears are real. and they come from the center of who you are. To me, that's evoking. The first is manipulating. It was good marketing. The second is, that's a real human emotion, and you pulled it out of me. And I want to be, as far as, it depends on me, somebody who evokes but doesn't manipulate. So I'm just wondering, and I'm thinking about really honest, hardworking, hard-praying pastors who have never seen this, who are like, Lord, are you passing over me? Any final words on those of us who would love for this to happen, but perhaps it hasn't happened, and evoking versus manipulating and trying to bottle something and make it happen again?
Yeah. I think the two things I would say, first is, how could you prepare your place to be the most empty and entrustable place for him to fill? Mm-hmm. Like, how do you prepare a manger for Jesus to come? How do you prepare a table for him to come and give it your all? Mm-hmm. But this is really key. Do it unto the Lord and not unto revival.
Right.
Ask these hard questions about preaching and the conversation we had about ecosystems. Wrestle with that. Wrestle with how you're creating space for the next generation to use their voice. Testimonies, confession, lingering in worship. Wrestle with that and create the most entrustable vessel that, if Jesus wanted to uniquely pour out, he would say, that place. I like that place. Knowing that he can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And then the last thing I would say, and I've wrestled with this, I have a great counselor, but I also really can honestly say this, the thing I am the most proud of, Carey, and the reason why the book could do very poorly or the book could do very well, I could be done with podcasts or I could keep on growing and whatever, is I'm way more excited that I'm a friend of Jesus than I am the guy who preached at Asbury.
Cool.
The prize is Jesus. The prize is John 15:15. I am not a slave. I'm a friend. The prize is Romans 8:14, that I am a child of God. The prize is John 14 and John 16, that I am a temple the Holy Spirit fills. A gift was that I got to be a part of Asbury, but the prize is Jesus. So, Pastor, the prize is you're a friend of Jesus. The prize is you're a son and daughter of God. You're a temple for the Holy Spirit to fill. Now, if God uniquely moves in your midst, that's a gift, but that's not the prize of everything we're doing. So Galatians 6:9 is how I've been ending most of my conversations. Is don't grow weary in doing good, for in due time you'll reap what you sow if you don't lose heart. So if you've lost heart for growing weary, you have a friend in Carey and I. Don't grow weary. We're with you, bro.
Yeah.
We're with you, sister. Yeah.
And the thing I love about our faith, the thing I love about God is the Spirit blows where it will, the wind blows where it will. And for you, back to where we started an hour and a bit ago, it was just another chapel service where mandatory attendance and kids wearing hoodies and AirPods, and God did something in his sovereign goodness that shocked and surprised everybody in the room. Mm-hmm. Now that's cool.
Me included.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, your new book is called Lower. Want to thank you so much for writing that. It's available everywhere. And if people want to find you online, Zach, where's a really good place to find you these days?
Yeah, I'm pretty low key, but I am on Instagram. So that's just at Zach Meerkreeb. And then we have a website that we had to create just to help kind of corral conversation. So that's zachmeerkreebs.com. Great. Yeah, Zach, thank you, bro.
Thank you so much. I really, really have appreciated this. And what a great introduction or overview for all of us who weren't in the room. Thank you.